I think the job of research is to stop and think and unpack those opinions and ideas and effects that images have every day without us even noticing. I'm Jennifer Good. I'm a senior lecturer in the history and theory of photojournalism and documentary photography here in the photography programme at London College of Communication. I'm a writer and a researcher. I supervise PhDs. I also am part of the Photography in the Archive Research Centre here. I originally trained as an artist, specifically as a printmaker. I worked a lot with printmaking and textiles, but during that original degree, I actually, by the end of that degree, found the reading and writing element of my course, which we called contextual studies, the most interesting and that aspect that suited me the most. And my PhD ended up having very little to do with art history and everything to do with these photographic responses to the 9/11 attacks. And so that work kind of went in a direction that I never imagined initially and ended up placing me very much in terms of a subject specialism having to do with photojournalism and documentary photography, which is how I ended up here at LCC. My research is predominantly cohered around ideas about photography and violence. That's really the main thread that runs through everything that I've done in my research practice. So not just photographs of violent events, but ideas about the sort of social uses of photography in the aftermath of violent events. So I'm really interested from a kind of a social and even a psychoanalytical perspective in the role that photographs play in the aftermath of violence and what we use them for and how we use them for processes of commemoration and sense-making. Well, I'm currently kind of moving from a focus on terrorism as a particular form of violence into a consideration of more intimate forms of violence. So domestic violence has been a recent focus. I'm looking at the work of Donna Ferrato, who's a photographer who very famously photographed at very close quarters as an eyewitness incidents of domestic abuse. And so I've been interested in the role that photography plays in capturing that kind of an event and communicating ideas about that kind of violence more socially. Well, I'm a member of PARC, the Photography in the Archive Research Centre. I'm also a member of the War and Conflict Research Hub that is kind of a subgroup of that. There are a number of us, particularly working within the area of photojournalism and documentary photography, who have an ongoing interest, and in some cases a very high-profile interest in practice in relation to violence and terror, and particularly ideas of state violence and how state violence becomes visible or invisible. Yeah, there is a second strand to my research which has to do with teaching and learning and ideas about learning, and that has been quite an exciting and new development for me in the past few years, involving my students in research workshops and experiments and finding ways of connecting what I learn from my students with how I inform my practice going forward. So that's something that I'm still developing, and it's really exciting to be working with my students, not just PhD students, but also my BA students as part of my research practice. The kinds of work that I write have a number of different audiences. So I do write for magazines and for other kinds of academic journal publications, for example, but it's really in the book format that I feel I can have much more of a kind of in-depth engagement with subjects, but also a more direct kind of relationship with readers. So for example, there's a book project that I recently published with my colleague Paul Lowe, who's also in the photography department, which is for students. It's really an outcome of 10 years or so of the teaching practice that Paul and I have both been engaging in different ways. And for me, it's been a really interesting way of reflecting on my teaching, but also obviously of communicating it. I supervise 3 PhD students currently. I'm relatively new to PhD supervision, but it's been a fantastically rich and stimulating part of my practice as a teacher and as a researcher. The 3 PhD students who I'm working with are all in the areas of photography or lens-based media. Some have to do with looking at the history of photo books, for example. Others are looking at ideas around the relationship between photographer and subject and the news media and different aspects of those things. PhD supervision relationship here at UAL is very different from what I experienced when I was a PhD student. I had one supervisor, and it was a very isolated and intensive kind of singular pursuit. But here it's much more open and much more connected. So all of the PhD students who I supervise have a team. I'm part of a team supervising them, which is a really interesting and productive way of working. So it's really discursive. It's really based on conversations and the sharing of views. Sometimes supervisors disagree. Sometimes that's really interesting. Sometimes the meeting consists of the student arguing for their position against what the supervisors think. And to me, that's really productive and exactly what a supervision process should look like. I think the research culture at LCC is really interesting, and one of the reasons for that is because of the number of practitioners and research students who are working in a practice-based way in relation to their research. And practice-based research, practice-based PhDs is a really wide open field, and LCC, I think, strikes a really interesting balance in supporting and supervising that kind of research while also leaving lots of space around it for us as a collective, as a group of practitioners and researchers to understand what practice-based research is and what it means, and not just practice-based research but also how more traditional research like mine that takes a written form relates to the practice that goes on around us in this space every day.